Michael Carter never thought he'd hold anything fancier than a socket wrench, let alone an invitation with his name emblazoned in black script. It smelled like old paper stock, clean ink, and $1,000 dinner he didn't ask for. He held it with the same cautious hands that smelled faintly of motor oil, as if it would vanish with a blink. There it was. His name, printed on cream-colored paper under the crest of the Bennett Foundation, inviting him and his family to their annual scholarship gala at the Riverlight Hotel. He turned the envelope over again, looked at the return address, read the letter twice just to be sure. No mistake. It wasn't a promotional ad stuck between bills. It was an intentional, direct invitation to a night held in honor of students like his daughter. Specifically, Emma Carter, who had just earned a prestigious Bennett scholarship at Portland's most elite private school. If this event was for families like his, he didn't feel it. After all, Michael wasn't a CEO or a doctor or a senator. He was a mechanic, a single father with grease-stained hands, spent shoes, and a house held together more by heart than hinges. He fixed things for a living, brakes, engines, heaters in the dead of winter, and made just enough to scrape by. Emma, though, she was made of light. Bright, curious, and quietly fierce. The kind of girl who could turn a box of bolts into a science project and still ask thoughtful questions about galaxies before bed. He should have been proud, he was proud. But that gala, that high-gloss, chandelier-lit night of champagne and fundraising, that world, he didn't belong in it. His first instinct was to tuck the envelope away. Just like the unpaid bills, old repair notices, and take-out menus that piled in the kitchen drawer labeled later. This, too, could be a later. What would he wear? Borrow a suit from his neighbor? Polish up old shoes that hadn't shined since the Clinton administration? What would he say to men who spent more on cufflinks than he did on groceries? That fear crept in, unspoken but real. The fear of being looked at the way people sometimes looked at him when he paid in coins or filled gas in small amounts. The quiet humiliation of being seen, measured, and found lacking. But Emma saw him differently. She walked in just as he was slipping the invitation back into its envelope. "You're not throwing that away, are you?" she asked, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Michael avoided her gaze. "Just not sure I fit in at that kind of thing." Emma didn't raise her voice. She didn't whine or plead. She just sat next to him at the kitchen table, placed the letter between them, and said simply, "Dad, you do deserve to go. They should see you. You're the reason I got there." Her voice didn't tremble. It carried conviction, a quiet, steady belief that hit him harder than shame ever could. Michael blinked, the lump in his throat unexpected. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw no doubt in her face. No embarrassment, just pride. It wasn't about tuxedos or spotlights. It was about standing beside his daughter's success, as proof, not decoration. That night, after Emma went to bed, Michael sat in silence at the kitchen table. Lit only by the flickering glow of the stove clock, he stared at the invitation like it might wake up and ask him to become the man it expected. He thought of early mornings patching Emma's modest school uniforms, the gas station stops for cheap coffee before crosstown school drop-offs, the nights he sat awake wondering how to stretch old tires and older dollars. He thought of Emma, her head tilted to the stars as she spoke of becoming an astrophysicist. "Every star has a story," he'd once told her. Now, maybe it was time to prove they could be part of one. Not to impress anyone, not to wear borrowed shoes with fake pride, but to show his daughter something her textbooks never could. That courage doesn't always look loud. And dignity doesn't need everyone's permission. Michael Carter decided to go. He didn't walk in like someone who belonged. That's not who he was. He walked in like someone who earned the right to be seen. The night arrived with an unease he couldn't shake off. like an itch beneath the borrowed navy blue suit. He tugged at the jacket's sleeves, polished old shoes as best he could, and let a neighbor insist on a single spritz of cologne. He stood in front of the mirror and didn't see a gentleman. He saw Emma's father, and that was enough. He drove his rust-trimmed pickup through the glowing Portland streets. Downtown was alive with valet lights and red carpets, storefronts dressed like Broadway sets. He parked 2 blocks away, on purpose, so no one would see the aging truck, the cracked rear window held together with tape. Every step toward the Riverlight Hotel was like approaching another world. The entrance outside shimmered, marble steps, valet attendants in tailored coats, laughter that sounded rehearsed. Women moved in gowns that caught the light like crystal. Men stood upright in dark suits that cost more than his monthly rent. Michael paused at the sidewalk. He felt it deeply, that sting of comparison, loud even in silence. But he heard Emma, her voice echoing through the buzz in his chest. "They should see you." He took those steps anyway, one by one. Inside, the lobby opened into opulence. Chandeliers like glass suns, walls of polished wood, air thick with designer perfume and polished intentions. Waiters glided by like trained ballerinas, silver trays held effortlessly high. People didn't walk, they floated. Michael stood at the entrance, still, quiet. He saw the moment people noticed him. A pause in conversation. A glance. A whisper. He wasn't wearing brand names. His cufflink was actually a safety pin, holding a shirt that didn't quite match the jacket. Someone near the bar chuckled. Another whispered behind long acrylic nails. They didn't need to say much. He could feel the verdict before they delivered it. Poor guy doesn't belong. They didn't know him, and they didn't care to. Still, he nodded politely to a well-dressed couple. They barely nodded back. A man looked him up and down and turned away. To them, he was a mix-up. The help, maybe. A valet who wandered in too far. He sat at a table marked with his name. The others didn't make room for him. A woman in silver offered a tight-lipped smile laced with disinterest. "How nice," she murmured, eyes already moving elsewhere. Another guest didn't even look up from his phone. To them, he was invisible. Michael, steady as ever, simply sat tall. No slouch. No slinking into shadows. He wasn't performing sadness or fighting for approval. He was present, and that was enough. He thought of his father. Calloused hands, sawdust in his hair, dignity untouched by hard days. "Dignity isn't something you wear. It's something you carry," his father used to say. Michael carried it now, layered beneath the ill-fitted suit and tired soles. He sipped water, not wine. Not because he feared it, but because he needed a clear mind to remember why he came. He came because Emma believed in him. And some things are sacred. The laughter around the room was soft and sharp at the same time. Some of it warmed the space. Some of it tried to shrink him without words. It didn't matter. He had known louder silences, tougher rooms, harder nights. He sat steady in a ballroom that had no seat saved for him. Because for Emma, he would always show up. The air in the ballroom shifted. It was subtle at first, a hush that moved like a shiver through silk gowns and tailored suits. Conversations dipped mid-sentence, laughter paused just before its highest note. Shoulders straightened instinctively. It was the kind of quiet that arrived when someone significant entered the room, someone whose presence you felt before you saw. Isabella Bennett had arrived. She didn't storm in or demand attention. She didn't need to. Power wrapped itself around her like an invisible aura. She carried it in her posture, in the calm precision of every step, in the deliberate way her gaze met faces and moments, never rushed, never performative. Her emerald gown shimmered beneath the chandeliers as if catching every sliver of light in the room and bending it effortlessly her way. It wasn't costume. It wasn't dazzle. It was something quieter, more certain. Authority without arrogance. Michael saw her the way everyone did, first from the edge, then all at once. He recognized the name long before he recognized the person. The countless letters on scholarship papers, the silent signature on the gift that had changed Emma's world. To him, Isabella Bennet existed like a distant star, real but unreachable, present but untouchable. He didn't expect her to notice the man in the borrowed suit. He didn't expect her to glance past the shine and shimmer to see someone who wasn't supposed to register on anyone's radar. But then her gaze found him. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't vague or slow. Her eyes landed on his with quiet purpose. She didn't tilt her head to pretend politeness. She didn't skim over him like he was another fixture in the room. Her eyes held. And in that single moment, something shifted. The room hadn't gone silent, but it felt like it. For Michael, the hum fell away. The gold and glass blurred. All he could feel was a steady gaze that wasn't pity, wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. She nodded once. It was small, barely a motion, but it wasn't meaningless. It carried weight, deliberate, clear, the kind of nod that could level mountains of doubt if you let it. It was as if in that moment she was acknowledging not the borrowed suit or the rusted truck outside, but something deeper. The reason he was here. The dignity that lived quietly in his spine and never asked for a microphone. Michael returned the nod just as subtly. Inside, something firmed beneath his ribs, something simple. He mattered. Not for show, not for applause, but because someone who'd built skyscrapers out of legacy and loss had looked past a room full of names and had seen a man with his hands in his lap, heart steady, pride intact. Around him, others silently noticed. A whisper here, a glance there. At one table, a woman with pearl earrings tilted her head, her carefully trained smile faltering just enough to suggest confusion. A man 2 places over lowered his champagne mid-sip and raised his brow at a companion. "Did you see that?" It was all too fast for words, but it didn't need words. The room had spent decades learning unspoken languages. And they all understood what had just happened, even if no one could say exactly why it mattered. A few seats away, a man glanced at Michael with new weight in his eyes, as if redoing the calculation. 1 second ago, he had been background. Now he was somehow something else. No one was foolish enough to challenge Isabella's choices outright, but they didn't have to. The murmurs began without sound. Perhaps he was a scholarship case she was trying to keep happy. Maybe a publicity gesture, a charity story. Maybe it was nothing. But beneath their breath, people were already editing the story to match the ending they wanted. Michael didn't notice right away, not beyond the first few flickers. He just knew he felt suddenly warm beneath the collar. Attention was louder when it arrived from people who had ignored you all evening. But he didn't flinch. He didn't shrink. He turned slightly back toward his table and took a quiet sip of water. The silence in his own chest felt louder than the thunder of voices around him. But it didn't shake him, not anymore. The people at his table still hadn't spoken to him. A woman in a silver gown leaned toward her partner and murmured something behind the rim of her crystal flute. Another couple kept glancing at Isabella, then back at him, then away, trying not to let the confusion crease their expressions too clearly. But Michael didn't move. He didn't fiddle or explain. He sat in the same posture that had carried him through union meetings and mechanic benches, through single parenthood and scholarship forms. Upright, calm, quiet, present. Eventually, needing air not scented with French perfume and social calculation, he slid quietly away from the table. Few noticed, fewer cared. He followed the tall windows along the back wall, past velvet curtains pulled a few inches wide, to the terrace that wrapped around the ballroom's edge. The glass doors stood cracked, just enough to let in a breath of night. Michael stepped through them and felt, finally, like he could exhale. The Portland skyline rose around him, tall and scattered like a dream drawn from steel and light. Below, the rush of night traffic washed through the streets like a never-ending tide. Up here it was quiet. He leaned on the stone railing and let the cool air steal some of the tension from his shoulders. In this place, there were no eyes measuring his steps. No hushed tones waiting to name him. Just the open night, just stars. He didn't hear the footsteps behind him, but he felt her presence. Isabella stepped onto the terrace with such gentle gravity it barely rustled the air. She didn't bring the noise of the ballroom with her. Out here, she was stripped of pretense. No spotlights, no ceremony, just a woman standing under the same moon. "I needed to breathe," she said, arms folded lightly across her stomach. Her voice dropped the polish now. It was low, honest, maybe even a little tired. Michael, still watching the city below, replied without turning at first. "Yeah, gets heavy in there." A quiet passed between them. Not silence with edges, but the kind that felt natural, like stones smoothed by a river. She moved to stand beside him, close but not assuming. Her eyes scanned the lights the way someone scans memories. Then she turned and looked at him. "You're Emma's father." It wasn't a question. Michael gave a soft smile and nodded once. "Yeah, she's the best thing I ever did." Isabella smiled, real and involuntary. She gave a beautiful speech at the scholarship reception, talked about dark matter, black holes, stars, and you. She said you taught her to map the sky from your truck. Michael laughed just once, low in his chest. "Open roof on clear nights. I'd show her the stars and tell her everyone had its own story." She looked up, her eyes glittering in the soft spill of light. "And you gave her one big enough to chase." He glanced at her, unsure of what to say. She wasn't being poetic. She meant it. There was no performance in her tone now. No stage. Just another parent who knew how far you had to stretch to build something stable for your child. Michael studied her then, not as a billionaire, not as a foundation head, but as a woman. He saw the wear behind the polish, the warmth behind the posture, not sympathy, not distance, just someone who understood the cost of carrying others through. For the first time that night, he didn't feel like a stranger in a borrowed life. He felt seen. Not pitied. He said nothing for a long moment. Neither did she. They stood in quiet agreement, not trying to name it, not trying to decorate it, just letting it be. And somehow, that was more than enough. When they stepped back into the ballroom together, the shift was immediate. Voices caught in throats. Eyes turned before they could be subtle. Questions bloomed behind cocktail smiles. Everyone knew where she had gone, and more importantly, with whom she had returned. And the room, glittering and precise, suddenly didn't feel so certain of itself. When Michael and Isabella walked back into the ballroom side by side, the hum of the evening didn't just pick up, it changed. Conversations didn't pause so much as they stumbled. Smiles wavered. Postures straightened a bit too quickly. Heads turned, then turned back even faster, as if caught watching something they weren't supposed to see. She didn't return to her seat briskly. There was no rush in her step, no apology in her bearing, and that was what made it louder than any scene could have. Her calm, her intention, the certainty in her movements. As if this, walking beside a man in a suit that fit wrong in all the ways a room like this noticed, was not unusual, as if it didn't require explanation at all. But for the people watching, it did. Because Isabella Bennett wasn't careless. She wasn't impulsive. And she wasn't known for sharing her time with just anyone. So if she chose to leave the gala in the middle of the peak hour and return from the balcony with someone none of them had spoken to, it meant something. And they needed to know what. Michael could feel the heat bloom around him, not from lights, not even from embarrassment, but from the pressure of eyes that had suddenly stopped pretending they weren't looking. It was sharp, not hateful, just curious. But curiosity in that room was territory dressed in velvet and barbed wire. It had a bite. He made his way back to his seat slowly, his steps steady, unfaltering, as though he hadn't noticed the shift. He lifted the same glass of tap water, held it in the same hand, kept his shoulders even. But everything around him had started to vibrate with subtle questions, the kind that never got asked aloud. No one said anything directly. No one needed to. The discomfort didn't come from insults. It came from invalidated expectations. A man like him was supposed to walk in, stay silent, and disappear before midnight. He was supposed to nod at the right moments, laugh more than necessary, thank people for glances, and accept marginalization like someone handed it on a branded napkin. He wasn't supposed to be seen by her. He wasn't supposed to return beside her, a step behind at most, but not like this, like an equal. At his table, a woman leaned toward him with a smile lacquered so tightly it barely moved her cheeks. Her earrings swayed like tiny verdicts. "So, Mr. Carter," she said, voice sweet but eyes sharp, "how exactly do you know Miss Bennett?" Michael met her gaze, calm and unhurried. "We talked," he said simply, "about our kids." She blinked. It wasn't the answer she was fishing for. She expected a performance, a story, something that would put things back where they belonged in her mind. But Michael gave her nothing more than the truth, unadorned. He didn't need to win her over. He didn't owe her a story. And that was what made the answer so powerful, its simplicity. She nodded slowly, a smile twitching at the corners of her mouth as though trying to find its relevance again. She turned back to her table partner with a blink that meant she had no more hooks to cast. Around the room, the murmurs gathered momentum, like wind through tight hedges, quiet but pushing against the silence. Maybe he's her charity pick this year. Isn't her foundation expanding to underserved regions? PR, maybe? Probably just a nice gesture. But the tone had changed. They weren't dismissing him anymore. They were explaining him, needing to, trying to make him make sense again. Because for Isabella Bennett to not just see someone outside the circle, but to choose them, even briefly, rattled the invisible rules that held this room so carefully in place. Michael knew it, and still he gave them nothing. He didn't fold his posture, he did mimic laughter, he didn't retreat into polite silence. He did what he always did, stayed steady, honest, present, a man, not a character. His refusal to shrink made the room lean harder. And the more they tried to reshape the moment, the more the moment reshaped them. Back near the front, Isabella continued with the event as if the world hadn't spun sideways. She resumed her place among honorees and administrators, gave her attention freely when called for, nodded with poise during bids and donations. But beneath the surface of every interaction sat the new unspoken headline of the evening. Isabella Bennett shared her spotlight, her language of legitimacy, with someone they did not choose. It was not an announcement, no grand speech, no clinking of glasses. It was truth by proximity, and that made all the difference. The final portion of the night approached, the part everyone waited for, the part where influence became sport, the charity auction. Velvet-bound catalogs lay strategically across the tables, heavy with offers most people outside this room would never dream existed. Private safaris, a villa in Saint-Tropez, front row seats to a Fashion Week runway with backstage passes attached. Michael didn't pick up the catalog, he didn't pretend to browse. The numbers meant nothing to him except how far out of reach they sat. He quietly watched, sipping water, watching paddles rise without hesitation. 40,000, 50, 70, for dinners, for weekends, for a case of wine aged longer than he'd been a father. And then came the final item. The room pulled in its breath almost instinctively, like a ritual. The auctioneer, a man with gleaming teeth and a cadence smoother than opera, lifted the microphone like a conductor raising a baton. "Ladies and gentlemen, our final offering tonight," he said, his voice glowing with performance. "A private dinner with Miss Isabella Bennett herself, hosted at her estate, prepared by her personal chef with wine from her family's collection. An opportunity for fellowship, inspiration, and..." He paused with indulgence, perhaps even a bit of strategic conversation. A ripple ran through the room like electricity. Paddles rose before the first number was even named. 10,000, 30, 50. The silence had broken. Excitement now traveled in crisp numbers and eyes sparking behind champagne glasses. Power was not subtle in this room. It performed under the pretense of charity. Michael continued to sit quietly. He had no paddle. He had no price to pay for dinners he hadn't asked for. Just as the auctioneer called for a $60,000 bid. Isabella stood. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it stopped every fork midair. All noise slipped beneath the tablecloth. "I'd like to make a change," she said. The auctioneer hesitated. He looked at her as if wondering if he heard her correctly. She turned, not embarrassed, not unsure, poised. "I'd like to place the final bid," she said, "in the amount of $100,000, paid immediately to the foundation." The room reacted as if a glass had shattered, but she didn't pause there. She gestured, subtly, gracefully, to the table Michael sat at. "In the name of Michael Carter, and if he agrees, I'd like to share that dinner with him." The breath left the room. Not in anger, not in awe. In recalibration. Because everyone again had to relearn the map of the evening, had to redraw the lines. She had thrown a stone into still water, and now every eye, every whisper, every interpretation hurried to catch up. Michael sat stone still. He hadn't moved, not from fear, not from doubt, but to ensure he was hearing what he thought he was hearing. Every head turned. Some eyes widened. A few narrowed. Soft gasps like thunderclouds forming beneath velvet gowns. Someone whispered, "She's joking." But she wasn't smiling. She was simply looking toward him. Waiting. Not demanding. Inviting. Michael stood. He adjusted his suit coat, second-hand navy, baggy at the sleeves. The room watched every motion like a slow-motion broadcast. He met her gaze and didn't falter. "If that's what you truly want," he said, voice low but strong, "then I'd be honored. Not dramatic, not performative, just honest." And in that honesty, the ballroom cracked a little. He didn't apologize, he didn't downplay, he didn't rise to their level. He brought his own. And suddenly everyone saw that maybe they had measured him with the wrong ruler. No one clapped. Not yet. But something deeper happened. For the first time, the room didn't see just a mechanic in a borrowed jacket. They saw a man who walked through a storm of silence and never broke his step. He didn't conquer them. He didn't need to. He simply showed up and stayed whole. The ballroom settled into a stunned hush. No one clapped, but their silence said more than applause ever could. Michael returned to his seat slowly, his presence thicker now, undeniable. The same people who once saw past him were now watching him too closely, adjusting their posture as if proximity could grant them understanding. Isabella sat at her table like nothing unusual had happened, but the atmosphere shifted. The rules of the evening, of hierarchy, appearance, belonging, had been rewritten in a single gesture, and no one quite knew what to do with the new draft. Michael didn't glance around. He didn't need to. Let them wonder, let them whisper. He was still the same man who stitched together Emma's school uniforms by hand and counted coupons without shame. He hadn't changed. Their perception had. That wasn't his burden to carry. As the gala ended and guests began to filter toward the exit, the hush gave way to speculation. Whispers flowed down marble steps, floated outside to waiting cars. Some insisted it was strategy. Others called it sentiment. But none could dismiss what they had seen. The man who wasn't welcome in their conversations had just been asked to dinner by their host. Isabella caught up with him in the lobby. The chandeliers, dimmer now, reflected less sparkle and more sincerity. They stood near the doors, the night air humming just beyond. "I hope I didn't put you on the spot," she said. Her voice was soft, laced with something unguarded. Michael looked at her for a long moment, not as a figurehead or foundation chair, just a woman who'd made room beside her for someone the room had refused to see. "You didn't," he said, smiling faintly. "You gave me a place I didn't know I needed." She relaxed just slightly. It was a truth she didn't expect, and it moved her more than flattery could have. "I wasn't trying to prove anything," she said. "I know," Michael replied. "That's why it meant something." They stood there for a moment longer, not filling the air with more than what mattered. "You're good at reminding people what's real," she added. And Michael, with a steady nod, said, "So are you." When the doors opened and they stepped back out into the Portland night, no one snapped photographs. No one clapped. The sky was quiet above them, their footsteps soft against the sidewalk. And yet something had shifted for both of them. This night hadn't ended with applause. It ended with clarity. He had come expecting to survive something. Instead, he'd been seen. The world hadn't changed, but his place in it might have begun too. And somewhere at home, Emma was asleep, unaware that her father had reminded an entire room what dignity looked like when it refused to perform. The morning after the gala came quietly. Michael woke before the sun, same as always. The house wasn't any bigger. The floors still creaked, the coffee pot still sputtered, and the kitchen table still leaned just slightly to the left. But something in the air felt different, lighter somehow. As if the weight he didn't know he'd carried for years had quietly slipped off his shoulders and stayed somewhere back at that ballroom. He sat in the same chair he always did, sipping coffee from the chipped mug Emma had painted years ago. The silence was peaceful, steady. Then the shuffle of feet broke it, light but rapid, and in came Emma, damp hair from the shower, one sock on, backpack slung over a shoulder. "Dad," she gasped, excitement flashing across her face. "Did you talk to her? Was it okay?" Michael smiled at her, and even that was different now. Not forced, not hiding anything. "Better than okay," he said. Emma squealed, threw her arms around his shoulders, and for a long second they stayed that way, her hugging him tight, him holding her just firm enough to keep the emotion from escaping his chest completely. Everything he had endured in that room, every judgmental glance, every whispered doubt, had been worth it for this. Later that week, an envelope arrived in the mail. Ivory paper, thick and smooth. No postmark, hand-delivered. Inside, a letter, inked by hand, Isabella's handwriting. It was simple, elegant, and warm. She thanked him for his honesty, his presence, and his quiet strength. "You reminded me," she wrote, "why I started the Bennett Foundation in the first place." At the end, she included an invitation, not to another gala, not to another dinner, but to the Foundation's advisory board. For his voice, for his perspective, not for show, for truth. He reread one line more than once. "You changed more than just the evening. I'd like to see what else we might change together." He set the letter beside a photograph of Emma, her first day at her new school, lunchbox in one hand, eyes full of hope, and stared at both. One showing where she'd come from, the other pointing toward where they might go next. Michael didn't decide right away. He folded the letter carefully, slid it into a clean drawer separate from junk mail. Then he went back to work at the garage. Back to oil engines, honest paychecks. But everything felt a little steadier. Like his voice, too, had stretched a bit beyond the walls of his life. A few evenings later, he found himself walking toward a small cafe tucked into a quiet corner of downtown. No chandeliers, just string lights, warm bread in the air, and tables that didn't ask anyone to prove their worth. Isabella sat by the window. She didn't arrive with ceremony. No velvet ropes or escorts. Just her, wearing jeans and a green scarf, tea in her hands, eyes searching the outside world like someone who hadn't forgotten how small things held the most meaning. Michael sat across from her. "This feels more like me," he said. She smiled softly. "Me too." They talked about Emma, about the foundation, about what could change when people weren't too afraid to be human. They didn't speak of love. Not yet. But respect sat between them like a bridge already built. And when Isabella looked at him, not like a figurehead, not like a benefactor, but simply as a person finding her way alongside another, Michael recognized something far rarer than admiration. He recognized understanding. When their conversation reached a lull, Isabella leaned forward, voice low, quiet. "Do you think," she asked, "we might continue this?" Michael thought for a moment, not of suits or chandeliers or fundraising dinners, but of stars viewed through a pickup truck's open roof, of honesty, of the work it took just to stay whole. And then he nodded. "I'd like that. A pause. A smile. A beginning. Small maybe, but entirely real.